Welcome back, everyone. It's 15 minutes past the hour. I hope everyone's had a chance to have a satisfying break in between our very thought-provoking sessions. We have had to do a little bit of juggling today, but what's a conference or a workshop or a summit without a little bit of juggling? Thank you for keeping your spirits high throughout all of that. I want to now turn the event over to Honorable Blanford once again to introduce our next speaker.
Yes, thank you very much, Layli. And I'm very happy now to introduce to you in this section on trafficking experts, so to speak, in group discussion. The Carter Center has been a long-standing partner of the Republic of Liberia for almost 20 years. They have an office in Liberia as well and doing an outstanding and incredible work. I'm very happy to introduce to you a friend and colleague of mine, Ms. Laura Newman, Director of the Rule of Law Program at the Carter Center here in Atlanta, Georgia. Laura directs and implements the Carter Center's programming regarding transparency, good governance, and access to justice, including projects in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Laura developed the innovative Access to Information Legislation Implementation Assessment Tool and the Women and the Right of Access to Information project. In February of 2018, Laura convened the conference, Inform Women, Transform Lives, which culminated with the Atlanta Declaration for the Advancement of Women's Rights of Access to Information. Laura has written a number of articles and book chapters on the right of access to information. She has edited 6 widely distributed guidebooks on fostering transparency and preventing corruption, and has presented at numerous international seminars on access to information, legislation, implementation, enforcement, and use. She has also served as a consultant to the U.S. Department of State, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, among others. Prior to joining the Carter Center in August of 1999, Laura was staff attorney for senior law at Legal Action of Wisconsin and is a 1993 graduate of the University of Wisconsin Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to present a very good friend of mine, Laura Newman. Laura?
Thank you. Can you all hear me? When it's written down, your bio, it seems very short, but when it's spoken, I realize how long it is. So apologies to everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me a few minutes to provide some thoughts, and many congratulations to the organizers of this critical workshop. I also want to thank my team, our team in Liberia. I know you mentioned that we have an office. The Carter Center has a phenomenal team of experts, both issues of gender as well as access to justice and transparency, working together to support their country. So human trafficking, as we've heard, is a problem around the world, and it's intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic. Traffickers have exploited new vulnerabilities and preyed on many who experienced increased food insecurity, closed schools, and a loss of income during the pandemic. Globally, services for survivors have become more difficult to access, and justice for victims of trafficking even further out of reach. The government of Liberia, in this light, has recently passed the revised Trafficking in Persons Act. I know you've heard about this. I know it was discussed yesterday. This new act includes provisions for increased minimum sentencing for perpetrators and restitution for victims of trafficking. The Carter Center applauds this great advance. But as important as the law is, even more so is to assure that the law is being fully implemented. And implementation is dependent on many people. It's certainly part of what the government of Liberia must do, including the security forces, the security services, but it also includes the private sector and civil society. So when the Honorable Consul General and Ms. Lillian contacted me, or Layli, excuse me, contacted the Carter Center, we were thrilled to be able to bring some of our key civil society partners to the discussion, as it's really them that's going to play such a critical role in identifying and preventing human trafficking. And we're so pleased to make this link. As Attorney Ibrahim discussed earlier, we need all sectors to be involved in stopping human trafficking. She mentioned fishermen, hunters, market workers, local communities, and mothers. And as Ms. Marpan noted, the context around human trafficking is localized. For example, when we talk about Liberia, it may be less of an inter-country trafficking as it is an intra-country trafficking of people, particularly women and children, as they're moved within the country from one county to another. Considering the role of international travel is important, and that last speaker was phenomenal. I want to use him in the future too. I hope he's still on. Jory is amazing. And it's important to think about the international travel, of course, but perhaps even more so, we need to think about what it looks like in Liberia. And for that, the first question I think we ask is, how can we engage the motorcyclists and the transport union without Liberia, as they could be the front line in identifying and preventing human trafficking? How do we consider the role, and when we consider the role of youth, child marriage, access to justice, economics, and the complexities of the familiar and cultural norms, we need to think about all those different actors in Liberia that can come together. For these factors, we need to engage the chiefs, lawyers, civil society organizations, media, and transport workers to prevent human trafficking. For that reason, we're thrilled that with us in Liberia in the Monrovia office are the leadership of the National Council for Chiefs and Elders, the Liberia National Bar Association, the Association of Female Lawyers of Liberia, the Women's NGO Secretariat of Liberia, the Federation of Liberian Youth. We're joined by the Press Union of Liberia, the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission, NAMOT, Partners for Democratic Development, and the Federation of Motorcycle Transport Unions of Liberia. Working together, they're going to support the stopping of trafficking. They can provide, CSOs, as we've said, and traditional leaders are on the front line. They're on the front line in providing services, supporting survivors of trafficking, and mending communities that have lost people, including children, to trafficking. Raising awareness of what is considered human trafficking and the implications of the law will fall to these organizations and the local media. Traffickers are often trusted adults or community members who falsely promise greater economic or educational opportunity in urban areas. Particularly in Liberia's most rural and hard-to-reach communities, the role that CSOs and traditional leaders will play in combating trafficking is incredibly important. We also need to remember our security sector, including the Liberian National Police and the Liberia Immigration Services. They cannot be underestimated when considering the implementation of this revised anti-trafficking law. For that reason, we are also pleased that members of the Liberia National Police are with us at the Carter Center in our Monrovia office. But awareness of trafficking, whether that be forced labor, domestic servitude, sexual slavery, commercial sexual exploitation, or child soldier, is only the first step. I think there's a lot of questions that we still need to ask when we think about the Liberian context. For example, what happens if human trafficking is identified? Where should the person go? Who do you contact and what can they do? Is there a hotline, for example, when there's a suspected case or for survivors? How do you distinguish between a child that is being sent to a relative so he or she can go to school or for better support versus a child that is being sent against her will for forced labor or sex? And what are the resources for survivors of human trafficking? Have the police and immigration services been trained? Is there the capacity and resources for investigating and prosecuting these crimes? And what measures can be undertaken to further inform and educate the public? These are just some of the issues that our colleagues in Liberia will consider as they look to implement the revised law. And the Carter Center stands ready to support these anti-trafficking efforts. As a first step, the center is coordinating with the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia to identify participants for an upcoming U.S. Department of State International Visitor Leadership Program focused on human trafficking. Participants will travel to the U.S. to learn more about alternate models for laws, training, and practices that, as appropriate, can inform implementation in the Liberian context. Once again, the Carter Center is pleased to participate today, and we're looking forward to working hand in hand with the government of Liberia security sector, civil society, and traditional leaders to combat human trafficking in all of its forms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, for that. Sorry, it took me a minute to come off mute. That was really helpful framing, because I think that one of the most important roles that the Carter Center plays in the Liberian context is as a convener. And we have talked about throughout this workshop that it sort of takes a village to end trafficking, and to be able to pull those different important actors, particularly the community serving organizations, into a room, at a table, in conversation, and not just for one-off conversations, but for ongoing, enduring conversations. That's really been a strength of the Carter Center's work on the ground. And that's really a big part of why we wanted the Carter Center to be involved in this meeting today. And I do want to thank you, because I know that you're in Liberia. I wanted to thank you for convening all of the people who are in your conference room today, able to participate in this workshop. And they've been sending so many good questions in the question and answer box. And so I appreciate that. I'm sure that there may be one or two people who have questions that they want to ask you now. And we do have a few minutes if there's anyone. If you do, please put your question into the question and answer box, if at all possible. I know some people have been using the chat, and we're able to do that as well. But, I think that while we're waiting to see if anything comes in, I would love to hear you say more just about how the Carter Center itself has built effective relationships around a variety of issues and areas of work, and what can we, in terms of working on the issue of trafficking, learn from what you've done in these other areas.
Thank you. And just to be clear, I'm actually in my home. Unfortunately, as Cynthia knows, hurt my back. And so I stayed in Atlanta. So all of the work of convening has been by my colleagues who are in that room. And I know we've heard from a few of them. When we think about the role of the Carter Center, certainly, thank you for noting that we do value the ability to convene people. And I think that comes from just the staying course of the Carter Center. We've been in Liberia for decades, and we are led by an all Liberian team. Every single person that's working on our justice and our accountability and our transparency and our gender work, they are all phenomenal Liberian experts and all Liberians. And I think that's really important, because they bring that localized, that contextualized knowledge that none of us can from living afar. We have been able to bring in lawyers that have worked with us for a very long time. You heard from one of our attorneys. So we have lawyers, we have people who are community organizers, we have specialists and experts, and together they create this incredible mosaic that is the Carter Center in Liberia. We also have another program there, and I think it's important to mention our mental health program. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that hasn't been discussed as much, and I hope that, when you go back to Liberia, and I'm hoping, we can join you on that, is to really think about the survivors and the trauma and the mental health supports that they're going to need. But I think what you're seeing in the Carter Center, if we could put them on video, what you'll see are the most incredible colleagues. So it is about convening, but it's because we have these amazing partners. And I listed them from the youth through to the traditional leaders. And they've been incredible, amazing partners to the Carter Center throughout our work there. So it's really them that deserves all of the accolades. And we know that. And so we appreciate them and thank them. And that room is full of every bit of knowledge that I think is needed, including the Liberian National Police, to really make a dent in human trafficking in Liberia. And so it's exciting to see them all come together. And I think if we empower them to work together, they will make the difference.
Well, thank you. And I also want to lend my thanks to everyone that's in the Carter Center conference room in Liberia right now. I've actually been to those headquarters, and I look forward to visiting again. I know Cynthia and I are going to be traveling to Liberia next month, and I hope we get an opportunity to sit with some of the very people who are in that room right now. Well, thank you so much, Laura, for sharing your expertise and your point of view, because it's going to be very important moving forward. As I've said more than once throughout this workshop, we really view today's workshop, or this set of workshops, as the the beginning of something, not a one-off, not the end of something, but we really want to, you know, put a stake in the ground on this issue. We want to attract other people who are interested in working on it and then find effective ways to work together. So I hope we'll have a chance to keep working together over time. Thank you very much. All right, so we're going to transition now into our next session, which is another opportunity to speak with experts. And at this time, I would like to introduce Professor Lenny B. Benson, who is the Distinguished Chair of Human Rights and Immigration Law at New York Law School in Manhattan. She has been teaching and writing in the field since 1994. She's actively engaged in fostering pro bono legal services for immigrants. And in that role, she is currently serving as a senior fellow to Immigrant ARC, a nonprofit organization in New York that coordinates and supports over 22 nonprofit legal services organizations. She founded the Safe Passage Project, a nonprofit housed at New York Law School that serves immigrant children. Safe Passage Project is one of the largest providers of free legal services to immigrant youth in New York and is currently aiding more than 1,300 young people. Her most recent book with Mary Kroc is Protecting Migrant Children in Search of Best Practice. And in fact, I just met Lenny recently because we were working together to bring an Afghan woman activist to the Wellesley Centers for Women, given the recent crisis in Afghanistan. And I was so impressed with the breadth of her knowledge about the migration of youth and children around the world. And we got into a conversation about how that intersects with trafficking issues. And she agreed to share her legal knowledge around those issues. So she will provide a very unique perspective on the trafficking topic that we've been discussing throughout the workshop. So Lenny, I'm turning it over to you now.
Good morning, everyone. I'm joining you today from Arizona, which is my family home. I want to first acknowledge and thank Honorable Ms. Blanford and Professor Marpan of Wellesley for having me. I've only been able to listen this morning. I was deeply impressed by Jerry Hendricks and Laura Newman educating us, and I would love to hear more as well from all the participants. So just to give you up front, I'm going to be speaking for about 30 minutes, but we're going to have lots of opportunity for question and answer with Professor Marpian organizing that portion. Before I launch my slideshow, I'd also like to say that I am grateful to the lives that have been shared with me of immigrant youth from around the world, from the lawyers who have stepped up to provide their services without cost in the United States, to the school teachers, the social workers, the family members, the police officers, the community prosecutors, all of whom have to come together as a community of support to recognize, identify, and help these youth. And I wouldn't be able to share the stories and the information I'm going to share with you if those people didn't have trust in me. And so I really appreciate the audience today, and I hope I'll be able to be a resource for you in the future. And I really appreciate being here. Now I'm going to start my slideshow. I want you to know every image in this slideshow is not an actual client. They're all stock photos. I have a strong belief in protecting the privacy of individuals who make applications. While some are brave and want to come forward and be public activists, I usually try to help people shelter their identity. But the stories I'm going to share with you are based on real cases. So give me one moment as I now share my screen. Okay. And we're going to go from the beginning here. I think you've already heard today that one of the issues, especially for those in the transportation industry, but also for those of us in the receiving country, whether it's a child traveling from the US to Liberia, as we heard Jerry speaking, or someone who's come to the United States, it's being able to see the situation. Now, my remarks today are going to focus on young people under the age of 21 or under the age of 18. We use both age dates in our law, but I do not mean to exclude that some of the things I'm talking about would also be available to adults. So this is a worldwide phenomenon that children are on the move. The UNHCR, that's the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, estimates that at least 50% of all of the people who are displaced in their own country or have traveled to another country are women and children. And of the women and children group, a large percentage are what we define as unaccompanied children, children who are not traveling with a parent or legal guardian. Some are traveling with a relative or a trusted friend of the family, or even someone who we might call a smuggler, or we might call, it depends on your point of view, a person who is helping someone escape. And what the US law in particular, which is what the focus of my presentation, does give many additional protections and solutions for children who are not traveling in the care of a formal legal guardian or one of those parents. So I'm going to tell you the story of Bethany. She was about 14 years old when an aunt of hers contacted her and said, please come to the United States. I want you to live with me and my children. I have space for you in my home. You'll be able to go to a better school. In Bethany's home country, her family could no longer afford school uniforms or school books. The family was extremely poor, and the aunt was already regularly sending money home to support the family. So Bethany had no visa to come to the United States. So she did as many unaccompanied youth do in the world. She traveled from her home nation over 4,000 miles by train, by foot, by bus to reach our southwest border. When she reached the southwest border, she surrendered herself to the immigration officials at the border. And she said, I don't have a passport, I don't have a visa to come, but I can't stay in my home country. As, again, she's traveling without any adult, except she has an invitation from this aunt. When a child is caught at our airports or at our northern border or our southern border, that child is taken into the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services, into a division called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR for short. But that office is not treating these children as refugees, nor is it helping them resettle. It's simply the only federal agency that had any expertise at all in caring for unaccompanied children. And so many years ago, over 10 years ago now, the US government simply gave this agency the authority to house, to detain these children. Now, the vast majority of people like Bethany are released to a close relative, an aunt, a grandparent, a mother or father, a brother or sister. 95% of all the children apprehended by Customs and Border Protection, by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, by Health and Human Services are released within about 2 months to a close relative. Some of you in the audience may even know situations like this, where a child may have traveled even with a visa, but at the airport, those questions were asked and they're worried and concerned about the child. Why are they traveling alone? Maybe they even have a visa to come to the United States, but when the child says why they're coming, they're saying, I'm coming to live and go to school with my aunt. That's not the purpose of a tourist visa. So the child may have come through an airport, come through a border, and then is released to this trusted adult. Well, in this situation, everyone thought it was going to be fine. Bethany did, her family back home did. Her aunt initially promised she would have good care, go to school, everything would be fine. But very rapidly, the situation changed. Bethany was told she could not leave the house. The doors of the house were locked when the aunt left the house every day. The aunt put her in charge of a toddler to take care of that toddler. She told Bethany she couldn't go to school. And she also had her working during the day, cooking meals that the aunt then took and prepared for and sold as a street vendor. Bethany got up at 4 in the morning and she often worked till very late at night. She received no wages. When she asked her aunt about that, she said, well, I'm supporting your family back home. I send money every month. So this is what you have to do to help me. Bethany probably would have remained in the shadows, trapped in her aunt's life and in her family context, except that because she had been apprehended by Customs and Border Protection, which sounds terrible, put in detention, put into deportation proceedings, but it was that fact of being put into deportation proceedings that meant we met her at the New York Immigration Court. Our project, Safe Passage Project, offers free assistance to any child who appears in that court. We were there the day Bethany arrived, and we matched her with a pro bono or free lawyer. That lawyer built a relationship of trust with Bethany, and the aunt didn't want to get in trouble with immigration either, so she was bringing Bethany to her hearings. Still, Bethany never told us about the situation. When her lawyer asked her, "Are you eating well? Are you going to school?" Bethany lied and said everything's fine. One day, however, Bethany was very, very ill, and she begged her aunt to take her to the doctor, and her aunt would not do so. Bethany called her, took her aunt's cell phone, managed to take it into a bathroom, called her lawyer and said, "Please get me to the hospital." The lawyer came, took her to the hospital. Very sadly, it turned out Bethany had a rare form of stomach cancer. Because Bethany had to be admitted to the hospital and was now no longer in the care of her aunt, she told the truth about her situation. It took another 6 to 9 months of medical care, treatment, and finding a good placement for a safe place for Bethany to live with a foster family to convince Bethany to make an application as a victim of trafficking. It was so hard for her. She did not want the backlash in her family, to break the relationship between her aunt and her mother, their sisters, to break the heart of her grandmother, to traumatize further her family back home at the potential loss of all their income. One of the benefits of the T visa is that you can get a derivative benefit for your parent or siblings if you're a child. The happy end of the story is that trusted adult, the free lawyer, the person who built a relationship with Bethany, the social workers at the hospital, the Safe Passage Project team. Ultimately, Bethany was granted her visa. Her mother and brother were able to join her in the United States with green cards. Sadly, Bethany had missed treatment for so long, she died at age 24. What a story of both beauty and trauma. Let's go a little bit more deeply into the visa that helped Bethany and her family. It's called the T visa. You might think T stands for trafficking. It's actually a coincidence. Our statute has a lot of different kinds of visas. A visas for diplomats, G visas for people who work at NGOs, E visas for investors. But the letter T is the one that Congress adopted for victims of trafficking. And the statutory language is really intense and a little bit frightening. You'd think no one would qualify. It has to be severe trafficking. I'm not sure why Congress put the word severe there. And usually what the government does is say, what we're looking for is to show that the person who was the victim, adult or child, was enticed, forced, defrauded, coerced to come to the United States. It could be a sexual trafficking, engaging in sexual activity, or it could be forced labor. It could be a kind of, you have to pay off your debt because I paid for your trip. We call this sometimes modern day slavery. To apply for that T status, you actually have to be inside the United States. We can't help you apply for it from abroad. However, again, if you're a child, your parent and siblings under the age of 21 could be relocated with you later. And there is a requirement that you cooperate with law enforcement to bring the trafficker to justice. Now, notice that children who are under 18, Congress has said they are not forced to participate in a prosecution. I think that's wonderful that Congress recognizes that it's very difficult sometimes to be brave enough to come forward and bring a criminal prosecution. And in Bethany's case, I'm sad to say that the county authorities in Long Island, which is where Bethany was living, refused to prosecute the aunt. Nevertheless, Bethany was still protected by this statute. The trafficking victim, the person applying, has to also show that they would suffer harm. And again, Congress used the words extreme hardship. This is where advocacy is really important, with a lawyer helping you, usually having a psychological evaluation, a medical evaluation, an expert who can say why this experience will be with you the rest of your life. I want to admit here that this is a very difficult topic to talk about. It feels very judgmental at times, even when we use that very powerful label, trafficker. My own grandmother came to the United States in 1907 because my great-grandfather wanted her to be able to go to school and live in safety. My family is Jewish, and there were, at the time, racialized and religious attacks in Russia against Jewish children in particular. So my great-grandfather paid someone to pretend to be my grandmother's parents and to bring her to the United States. Just as Joyce told you just a few minutes ago, these documents didn't match up. The immigration authorities in 1907 let the two adults just enter the United States, but they kept my grandmother in detention at Ellis Island in New York. I did not know this story about my grandmother throughout her life. She never talked about it. It was only after she died at age 96, many years ago, that a cousin shared with me an oral recording that she had made, in which she told the story of these strangers pretending to be her parents and then abandoning her. She was going to be deported back to Europe, but her sister came forward and was able to promise the immigration authorities that she would care for my grandmother and would make sure she went to school. She signed an affidavit to that effect, and another relative posted a bond. But my great aunt had 4 children and needed help, and they were very poor. So my grandmother had to leave school at age 13. Throughout my life, my grandmother said, families who are surviving in the United States struggle. My family was not very wealthy, and people have to work and go to school, but she always encouraged me to stay in school. I'm very fortunate that I am who I am today because my grandmother made such a big sacrifice. Was my grandmother trafficked by her father and by those people who abandoned her and by her aunt who forced her to labor? Or was it simply what you have to do to survive? Well, the law does sometimes make us use these harsh labels, but I'm encouraging the audience to think of it as putting the child's interests first, which is a criteria in international law. And even though the United States is the only country in the world who has not signed the International Treaty on the Rights of the Child, our domestic law does protect children. So if you're aware of young people in the United States who are being forced to leave school, to work long hours, to not receive compensation, they may indeed have a remedy. In the United States, and it depends on the state you're living in, public school attendance is required. Some states allow children to have part-time schooling if they're working in agriculture. Some schools have programs to allow children to continue their schooling at night. But it is what we call our truant officers or our school officials who are on the lookout in our community for young people who should be in school and are not. Sadly, the United States domestic population has a very high dropout rate. And that dropout rate leaving high school is even higher for children of color. So it may not be uncommon in a city where you live, if you're in Atlanta or New York City or Los Angeles, to see teenagers working and maybe just assume that they don't want to be in school anymore. School's not offering them what they're looking for. But we need to look more closely because some of those children are not in school because they're under forced coercive situation to work to support their family abroad. Now I'm going to tell you a story of a young man from West Africa, and I'm not going to name the country, but he had a dream of being a football star. In the United States, we say soccer. I know in Liberia, this is a dream you all know. Your president made his successful world as being a world leader in soccer. I'm sure there's many young men living in Liberia today who hope one day they can too play professional football. Sadly, there are people who prey upon these dreams and hopes of talented athletes and young people by coming to rural areas and urban areas and promising them that if they'll come on a trip with the coaches and the talent scouts, they're going to bring them to the United States to possibly then get a college scholarship or to work in a professional setting in sports. The young man we met was in the streets of New York as a bicycle messenger. He worked in a bodega and he slept in the back of the store. But we didn't know any of this at first. The way we met him was on the soccer fields, one of our staff attorneys in Safe Passage Project was an avid footballer himself. And he saw this young man and he noticed he looked tired and hungry one day. And he asked him what's going on. And he said, well, I only come to these games when my boss lets me out. And I get paid $100 by the organizer of the game to come, play football with you. But the rest of the time I have to get right back to the store because if I don't do what he says, I'll never be able to pay back the debt. The family had put a mortgage on their farm to be able to pay for this trip for the young man to come to the United States to apply for that college scholarship. But it was all a charade, a fraud. Remember, the definition of trafficking is someone who's induced to come to the United States and then forced to work due to fraud. So this was not any kind of sexual activity, nor was Bethany's case. Both of these young men, Evan and Bethany, and these are imaginary names, they were forced under economic circumstances. Sometimes people are promised a good job in the United States. Economies are struggling, COVID's only make it worse. We heard that from prior speakers. And people know there's job shortages employment areas of shortage. There's hotels that are desperate for people to work. There's restaurants who can't staff themselves. The United States is experiencing a large unemployment level, but also people quitting jobs. Some unscrupulous people are trying to recruit people around the world to come and work in these industries. Sometimes it is forced sexual work. And if a young person under the age of 18, even if willingly engages in any sexual activity, that meets the definition of commercialized sexual trafficking. Of course, in the United States, in most of our jurisdictions, if you are arrested because you're engaging in commercialized sex work, our criminal system makes you the focus of a criminal prosecution. In many cities in the United States, however, now, our prosecutors are more progressive, more contextualizing, and they will work with that person they originally arrested on the streets or at a truck stop or in a brothel and try to help them with their immigration status. So in some cities, they actually provide free legal counsel to the people that are arrested who were engaged in sex work in an effort to break up commercialized vice, commercialized sex. Forced marriage is another area. You've heard about it earlier. And while in many cultures, families may be thinking they're doing well by their daughters, like giving them a husband who will support them, and this does happen across borders as well, a young person may be brought to the United States, perhaps with a fiancé visa, or even sponsored as a spouse, but that marriage is a violent one or an unhappy one psychologically. There are remedies for people, especially youth, but also adults who are forced into marriage. Well, we have a cap or quota on the number of these visas that can be issued every year. It's only 5,000 visas. And it's 10,000 for the U visa. I'm sorry, there's a typo in my slide. So 5,000 for the T visa, 10,000 for the U visa, which I'll talk about in a minute. Unfortunately, we have never reached that cap. We know there are thousands and thousands of people who are victims of trafficking, either labor or sexual work, and yet so few applications. I looked up the statistics just this morning. I have another slide for you later. This is saying that there's all kinds of waivers of other violations of immigration law if you're granted a T visa. This is an old chart, but it made a very good graph. The tall bar shows you we can go up to 5,000 visas, but the actual number of applications received as of 2017 was under half that. And the data from this year is that there were only 3,800 applications that were filed last year, and 1,000 of those were approved. So we're not even close to reaching that cap. But let's put this in context. Congress made a pretty low ceiling there, a cap, because every day, US Customs and Border Patrol inspects and admits at airports and land borders more than 1 million cars, vehicles, people in airplanes. So we have millions of people in the United States on temporary visas, on student visas, on working visas, and 11 million undocumented people. The fact that we're not reaching that cap is not because there aren't people being trafficked, but because we, the legal community, the community organizers, the people in the transit industry, we're not identifying these people. I'm going to talk really quickly about this parallel visa called the U visa. Again, doesn't mean anything. The letter U is just where it appears in the statutory code. It's for victims of crime. And when you first say that, people think, well, crime like rape or crime like assault, but forced servitude or being not paid the wages that you were promised. What's great about the U visa is the situation may have nothing to do with what happened at home. Maybe you came to visit relatives in the United States and you liked it here and you decided to stay and you overstayed your visa. About half the people or more in the United States who don't have papers came originally with a visa. And then they're offered a job, but they say, I know you don't have papers. I'm not going to pay you the minimum wage required by this local or federal law. That can be a basis of applying for a EU visa. And young people are particularly vulnerable here. An employer will say, well, you don't know anything, kid. You don't have any skills. So I'm going to start you out at $1 an hour, or you're only going to get tips. That violates our law. And in most states, the local Department of Labor or a human rights board will actually help that young person bring a wage and hour complaint, and then they can apply for a U visa. Well, sadly, the U visa is so oversubscribed that right now there's a backlog of 142,000 who've been approved for a green card based on this process, but they can only do 10,000 a year. The good news is, though, you can't be deported while you're waiting for that U visa application. Our government has a policy of ending any deportation proceeding. It may take time to get work permission. It may take time to ultimately get your permanent residence, but it is a path. But here's something I learned today that really made me sad. 91% of the applications for this visa are represented, of the people who are approved, are represented. That means that if you don't have a lawyer or a community organization behind you, it's very hard to get your case approved. And here are the top countries for the U visa: Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, India, and Ecuador. Where are the African countries in that list? While they may be a smaller portion of the percentage of immigrants living in the United States, we know that given the traditions of the professional people who engage in labor trafficking, we should have a higher rate of applications from Africa and a higher rate of people seeking these benefits. But if you can't find legal resources, if you don't have trusted partners in the community, you may not know this remedy exists. Now, this slide that I'm sharing, you can't read it, right? It's all these little boxes. What I'm saying is, wow, for children, there's a lot of other things that might lead to a path to status. There could be a family petition that could be filed, an asylum application. Let me give you an example of asylum. Some people coming from Africa, particularly women, but also could be a man wanting to protect a child, want to end the practice of female cutting or female circumcision. It is an illegal practice in many countries, including the United States, and it can be a basis for seeking protection as an asylum applicant in the United States. The T visa is there, the U visa, and we have an absolutely remarkable visa for unaccompanied children, where it's called a special immigrant juvenile status visa, where if a child has a guardian or a custodian who will go to family court and show that the parents have abandoned the child, perhaps like my great-grandfather did to the care of his oldest child to take care of his youngest, my aunt could have sponsored my grandmother and she would have had a path to a green card. For the African countries, there's no quota delay, there's no backlog for those people. And so if you know of African youth in the United States who have, maybe due to poverty, maybe due to broken families, maybe due to alcoholism or other problems, that child cannot go back to their family, they should be seeking special immigrant juvenile status. That's a lot of the work Safe Passage does. All right, let's go to my next slide. How can you help? I think you've already heard this throughout the workshop. It's really important that we build trust with the young people or the victims that we're trying to help. And sometimes it's not starting from a legal point of view, but being someone who talks to you on the soccer field, doesn't ignore you. When you go into the local corner store and you get your coffee and you see the child stocking goods, say good morning, get to know them. Many of the cases that I've worked on over the years were brought to me and to our legal organization by other American youth who befriended a child and then discovered they were forced to work in a Chinese restaurant or forced to be a bicycle messenger or not being paid wages, fair wages at a warehouse. But it's every level of society. We might only think about working class people, but it also occurs in other places like a family-owned business where they're developing real estate or engaged in high-level importation of goods. I have met people from Africa whose parents are quite wealthy and they wanted to force their daughter into marriage. She was able to use her contacts to get a sponsor to come on a business visa to the United States, and then found that that sponsor was going to want a kickback of her high-level wages. We were able to help her because she was being forced into marriage to file for asylum. So it's understanding and getting to know the person, maybe not calling them the victim. I know my slide says victim, but getting to build trust with that individual, whether you're a school official, a community organizer, a religious community friend, saying hello at the tea after church services or at the mosque where you go to celebrate a holiday, welcoming the stranger and building trust, and then trying to find a lawyer to help with that application. I borrowed a lot of these slides from the Coalition Against Slavery and Trafficking, which is an organization in California. And we can look for clues, like someone doesn't have any ID. Someone always says the same phrases in a kind of a memorized way about why they're here, that they don't mix and mingle with others, that they look like they're dirty or not well fed, that they look very tired in an inappropriate way, that they never have any pocket money. They don't have a cell phone, for example. In America, it's so ubiquitous. Someone not having a cell phone may be a sign someone's controlling them. And sexual trafficking can appear at a hotel, at a spa, at a truck stop, in the middle of an orange grove. In the labor industry, we've listed a lot of them. We know that about half of all the people who work in low-wage jobs are undocumented people who are exploited by the employers. Many of them would qualify for protection. I'm going to leave this slide up for a minute. I hope you'll jot down this number. We heard Laura say maybe in Liberia there needs to be a hotline to call. This is the national US hotline. Then it connects you with federal law enforcement. But think about how brave an immigrant has to be to call federal law enforcement. So it may be that we, people with papers, with status, are the ones who have to make that call. And we have to make sure we're working with law enforcement that is trained and sympathetic, empathetic to the needs of the person who doesn't have status or papers in the United States. So I'm going to say it in case some of you can't see the slide. 1-866-347-2423. Or you can text HELP to the number 1-888. To the number 233-733. You can text HELP. And that should help you get connected with a hotline where they can also direct you to people who have grants for legal services. California, for example, authorized $30 million to help support free legal services to victims of modern slavery. Well, you've heard me say it again, we can't be bystanders. We have to be engaged. We have to build trust, and we have to build community awareness. The Biden administration is doing some good things in immigration. We know that in the last administration, there were still lots of applications approved and applications moved through the process, but huge backlogs have built up. And so it was with good news just this last month that the part of Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the benefits section, said that they're going to retrain their officers to have an empathetic victim approach, to be more cautious and careful, friendly and supportive as people apply and come out of the shadows. They're also doing a lot of training with law enforcement. I have been to some of those trainings where it's a little bit frightening because it's people that you're normally opposite in immigration court. You have immigration and customs enforcement lawyers asking you to build trust in your community. They're the same people that arrest people in the community. That's a problem in the US system. We probably need completely independent prosecutorial agencies who will build trust with the community. It's a flaw in our system that we ask people to come forward to the very agency that arrests their friends and relatives. Remarkable accomplishment for Liberians. I just had to share this in this conference. In 2019, Congress passed a statute called the Liberian Refugee Immigration Fairness. Now, you don't have to be a refugee to qualify for a green card through this path. It's estimated that about 10,000 Liberians living in the United States of our population of 150,000 to 300,000, nobody knows exactly, would qualify for benefits under this statute. It's a very special kind of statute. You simply, it's forms and paperwork and filing fees, but you come forward, you go to the USCIS, you prove your Liberian nationality, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. You show that you've been in the United States since 2014, and you can apply for a green card. And if granted, they're going to retroactively assume that you should have had that green card years before, and you will be immediately eligible to apply for citizenship. That's remarkable because normally you have to wait 5 years after you get your green card to apply for citizenship. And having US citizenship means you can sponsor your parents for immigration if you're over 21, your brothers and sisters, although it can take 14 to 20 years, it's a long queue, or your own adult children, married or unmarried, for status in the United States. Well, we were very optimistic when Congress passed this remarkable statute that people would come out of hiding and come forward and apply. So in March of 2021, the Congressional Research Service reported that only 3,248 applications have been made so far. 666 were approved, 111 were denied, and most are still pending, over 2,500. Just giving you some idea of where these applications came from in America. 322 came from Maryland, 576 in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, the whole state, 496 in Minnesota, 258 in New Jersey, 216 in New York. And I know we have a lot of people from Atlanta on this webinar, only 185 from Georgia. Why are people not coming forward? Based on my experience in immigration law, I would say there's probably 3 reasons. One, people may have had an encounter with the police during their life in the United States. Maybe they were arrested for driving under the influence. They were arrested for driving without a license. They were involved in some minor crime or maybe domestic violence. Yes, having been involved with any kind of criminal activity in the United States means you need a special evaluation of whether you should apply, because this application can be denied and you could be put into deportation proceedings based on criminal activity in the past. Any kind of controlled substance conviction, including marijuana possession, could be a barrier. Although marijuana is now legal in many states, for immigrants to the United States, it is still a basis of inadmissibility or potential denial of benefits. I think there's another reason that Liberians are not coming forward to the degree we expected, and that is honestly systemic racism. I've been in immigration law since 1984, and throughout my life, I've seen that Haitians are not trusted. People from West Africa or East Africa are assumed to be lying, whereas the same scenario and conversation from someone from Cuba or someone from Poland or someone from Ireland is accepted. And so let us acknowledge that racism exists either as an unknowing implicit bias or as a real bias in our law enforcement. And so I urge you in the Liberian community and beyond to seek legal help. An organization called Undocu Black has a network of free legal providers, and I have these resources for you in the slides. These are the government slides, and I'm going to give my slides to the conveners to make available to give back to you so you can find all these resources. But nonprofits like the Coalition Against Slavery and Trafficking Los Angeles, World Without Exploitation at the bottom, my own Safe Passage Project, there's free resources there. You can find more information at undocublack.org about the Liberian Act. Here's the important point. The deadline is this December. We've got a little over a month and a half to have Liberians come out of the shadows and seek this benefit. And I want to mention another great thing about it. If you have family members still in Liberia, they will be able to have following to join, remedy benefits to join you in the United States. Maybe you've been separated for 20 years and you'll be able to finally reunite with your family in a rapid way. That would be your spouse or minor children. Or if they're in the United States with you but undocumented, they'll be able to qualify as long as one person, that parent or spouse, has been in the United States the requisite period of time. It's really a remarkable statute, and I hope people will take advantage of it. So stop sharing my slides and come back to full screen. I hope I've left sufficient time for questions, and I really entertain any that you would like to go further into. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Lenny. That was an incredible presentation. We can definitely file under news you can use, as well as the general sort of theoretical issues. I mean, you raised so many important points and you shared so many sort of heart-wrenching stories, but there are things that many of us who work in these areas see every day. We know people who are in these situations, and we're here at this workshop because we want to help in ways large and small. So I really, really appreciate that. One of the things that I wanted to ask, because it's so clear that you work with so many organizations where people in your legal profession have come together to kind of, pull your power and influence together to help others. What advice would you have for people in different professions who are thinking, how can I get more people together to increase the power of my work? Can you speak to that question at all?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're doing right now, where we're raising awareness and educating people about resources they may not even know, is so important. In public schools and parent-teacher association meetings, there are people who are hungry for information. I get a lot of phone calls from principals at high schools or even middle schools who are saying, I'm really worried about Bethany, or Evan stopped coming to class, and we think he's from Liberia, or we think he's from Guatemala. Is there any way you can reach out? Sometimes physicians, nurses, hospitals also see people, because in the United States, healthcare is not free. Many immigrants wait until there's a dire situation to go to the hospital, like Bethany's case, and making sure our social workers and medical personnel are cross-trained. Every year I do volunteer lectures in social work schools. Maybe we could even design, as many of these organizations have, online curricula that is free. If you go to the Coalition Against Slavery and Trafficking, and I had that link in there, castla.org, I think it is, it's based on Los Angeles. They have free on-demand trainings that people can get involved with. But we need everyone. You know, merchants associations in the United States who are trying to establish those practices. New York City, for example, just passed an ordinance that said you have to pay minimum wage. You can't just tell a bicycle rider you're going to live on tips. There's going to be education about that for the merchants. Merchants sometimes say, I can't compete if there's a bad merchant using exploited labor. Banding collective businesses together to create a floor, a ceiling of compliance is really important. I hope that's responsive, but we need college students, we need professors, we need social workers, we need medical professionals, and we need just the ordinary person who goes to the bodega to get a coffee every morning.
Right, that's so true. And, that's one of the reasons that we wanted to record this program so that it could be a resource. And so that, for example, people could hear your lecture over and over in different settings and draw down from those resources. I'm curious if you went to Liberia, and I don't know if you've ever been there, and you had an opportunity to speak with your fellow lawyers in the country, or if you had an opportunity to speak with members of judicial systems or criminal justice systems, what kind of questions would you ask to open up a conversation about strengthening those systems in Liberia to address and counter trafficking?
Well, first of all, I would be so honored to ever go to Liberia. I have not been able to go there. I found that my work as an immigration lawyer, I thought I would get to travel the world, but mostly I work from the United States. Our country is so filled with people in need here that I rationalize my staying here. But the first thing I would encourage other governments of the world, including Liberia, to do is please don't maybe focus with the angle of only law enforcement can solve the problem, and also to create trusted places and fund them adequately, such as safe houses. The nonprofits in the United States sometimes are the ones who have to build shelters and housing. Homelessness and fear of you have to stay with the people who are abusing you is one of the reasons people don't come forward. So if Liberian government can create organizations of trust and then have that organization be the conduit link to law enforcement, so that the person who's first coming forward, first being brave, gets food, security, counseling, safety before they're a witness in a trial or a prosecution. I think that's really important to successful work. And then I'd say, please don't put caps on your numbers of people who can benefit. That's so artificial. And it ends up that it takes a lot of the time of the lawyers in the organizations just managing the status of old cases that are going to take years to complete. They can't take on new cases simply because there's these artificial limits. It's very much about politics. The US doesn't want to incentivize fraud in the system. Let's not worry so much about the fraud. We know trafficking and victimization from forced labor is on the rise. Let's try to change the culture there before we worry about the immigration numbers.
Those are very helpful questions. And we also got one question from the audience that says, suppose that volunteers are interested in mitigating the risks of human trafficking. Are there recommended programs, courses, or links to help them pursue the required know-how? Obviously, you've offered a lot, but would you like to say anything more to this person's question about how, I'm Jane, volunteer, I want to get involved. What can I do?
Well, most of the organizations, again, if you start using our friend Google and just searching yourself in your community for who's doing this work, particularly in the United States, usually on a website of an organization, it will say, get involved, or we need volunteers. Language skills, cultural competency skills, even offering yourself as a community expert just to say, could I do a training for your lawyers to understand language, questions, how to be culturally competent? It's actually something lawyers now are required to learn to do, I'm very glad to say, because sometimes we are so filled with legal jargon that we talk down to people or we re-victimize them really by the language we're using. So I think just being your own self and coming forward and offering that, maybe just have a coffee, sit around a table and have a conversation, be very good. And again, most lawyers in this work try not to be judgmental. We're not blaming Bethany's aunt completely, but Bethany didn't have to stay in that situation of forced labor. The other thing I would say is if you are in the United States, you don't have to go to law school. But boy, would I love more people of color to come to law school, more people first generation, more people of immigrants. And many law schools will accept people to attend law school, even if you're undocumented. Now, in the United States, you do have to complete your bachelor's degree before you can have a law degree. But we also have a program where you can train to appear before U.S. Immigration Service or appear in immigration court, even if you're not a lawyer. And that's called becoming an accredited representative. It usually requires 40 hours of specialized training, and there are many programs now. Both Catholic Legal Immigration Network offers it, you don't have to be Catholic, and other people offer this where you can train and then you can work in a nonprofit under the supervision of a lawyer, greatly expanding their cultural competence, their expertise, and you'll be doing that work side by side with social workers and lawyers in that organization, providing low cost or free legal services. So I would love to, out of this program, to see a whole bunch of emails to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I really don't mind. And it may take me a few days to get back to you. Please forgive me. A death in my family, and so I'm going to be spending the next few days focusing on my family. But I will get back to you, and if I can, I'll direct you to where you might learn more. More questions?
Yeah, thank you, Lenny. That's extremely helpful. And I love some of these very specific suggestions you're making. For example, I'm sure that a lot of people don't know about this idea of an accredited representative, and imagine how powerful it would be for someone to be both a cultural expert or a language expert and an accredited representative. That would add so much benefit to the system, because I think there are a lot of people who don't step forward because they don't know how to connect through a language channel, or they worry that someone who doesn't understand their cultural will judge them wrongly, or will take things out of context, because it does happen. I mean, it's all part of that whole racism in the legal and justice system that I'm really glad you identified. I mean, I think that our own sort of non-statistical review of what we see around us sees how Haitians and Africans are treated in not only in legal systems, but in medical systems and, so many other arenas. So there are a lot of ways that we want to deal with that. I'm looking at a few other questions that are coming from. One person says, who benefits from your program? Are these services paid for by survivors or others who want to benefit from the service? I think there's that question about, sometimes people don't step forward because they think something costs something and they'll have to pay money that they don't have to get where they're trying to go. Can you address that?
Most of the nonprofits in New York and most of them in major cities, they don't charge anything at all. Now, the government does sometimes have filing fees. For example, that Liberian statute that I talked about, there is a filing fee there. For the U visa, the T visa, the special immigrant juvenile status, there's no fee. And there's also formal visa waivers of fees. If you go to get help and someone says, oh yes, I will apply for this U visa for you, but I charge $5,000. That might be what a private lawyer is charging. And you're saying $5,000, that's so much money. It is and it isn't, because it may be many, many years of work. And most immigration lawyers charge what we call a flat fee. So something I really encourage people to do is make sure you know who's helping you. Does that organization have a public website where you can look them up and make sure they're a bona fide nonprofit organization? In the Bronx, for example, in New York, we had a bona fide nonprofit organization, but they were charging people $40,000 and basically making them sign a contract of servitude. And it took 10 years to get U.S. Immigration Service to revoke their accredited status. But in New York, at least, and in other cities, you can go to a consumer fraud person and you will get your money back and you will get protected. Nonprofits generally do not charge for their legal services, but that means there's a long wait list. So sometimes going to your state bar association, they have pro bono, or pro bono in Latin means for the public good. It means free legal services. And again, progressive cities like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, some parts of Chicago, I'm not sure about Atlanta, they actually have some city council money that they're authorizing to be spent on behalf of immigrants. For those of you who might have the ability, fundraising to help a local nonprofit could be very valuable. And you may think, well, I don't have a lot of money myself, I couldn't do it. But even let's say you have a pancake breakfast and you raise a few $1,000s, you can then donate that perhaps to add social work support money. So for example, at Safe Passage Project, I started this project just as my own free time. Then my law school dean gave me a $15,000 stipend I could use to have a part-time lawyer helping me. And then he gave me $30,000. That's not a lot of money, but I was able to get people to donate 10 hours a week to do something like that. Today, Safe Passage has grown and it receives funding from the state of New York, from the city of New York, but the majority of funding is from individuals. So find your local community organization and see if you can help. And you can also say, I would like my money to go to help the victim have housing, food, transportation. And that is something that's really important.
That's a great point. I appreciate that. And actually, you're making me think about one organization that I work with, which is the Tahiri Justice Center in Washington, D.C. I'm newly on their board. And they also provide pro bono legal services for women who are refugees, immigrants, et cetera, particularly when they're experiencing domestic violence or other kinds of things. Trafficking could fall in that category. So it's important for people to know about and get the word out about these NGOs and nonprofits that offer the pro bono legal services, and people can often get what they need without having to worry about where they're going to come up with that money. Someone has asked an important question that I know is on a lot of people's minds. This is someone who's at the Carter Center group in Liberia, and they said, can the applicant of the T or U visa make application without risking the arrest of their family members?
So I want to say yes, because the branch of the government that adjudicates that T or U visa is not the enforcement branch, it's the benefits branch.
Mhm.
But they do a background check and they look for that criminal activity. So if anyone's ever had an encounter with police, even a bench ticket, maybe for drinking in the park or smoking a joint on the steps, you do need a lawyer to help you navigate that. Now, when that person then makes that application, they're going to disclose their address, they're going to disclose their household.
Mhm.
In my experience, that does not lead to ICE coming to the home.
Mhm.
However, the organization that you're working with, hopefully the lawyers that you're working with, will educate you about what your rights are.
Mhm.
ICE cannot enter your home without a warrant. They sometimes pretend they have a warrant. They say, oh, we've got a warrant here. And you say, slip it under the door. So there's a lot of free programs. They use these pieces of paper that they write warrant on it, but it's not a judicial warrant. You don't have to answer questions when you're stopped on the street or you're stopped at a bus station. You can say, I have a right to ask for a lawyer. I do not want to answer your questions. Now that may mean you're taken into custody, but you don't have to volunteer information about yourself. Under the Biden administration, they have reversed things that the Trump administration put into play. There are 1.4 million people already in deportation proceedings, some of whom want to be there because they're actually seeking asylum or benefits before the court. But because of that huge volume of work, the Biden administration has told the prosecutors to prioritize the cases. And so if your family member is an overstay or entered the country unlawfully, but isn't a serious criminal background, they are not a priority to be placed into removal, to be placed into enforcement. So you can never promise 100%. I've been in this field a super long time. I have not seen people who applied for U or T status have their family members arrested.
Mhm.
Unless, of course, the family member is the trafficker. So that is why so many people don't choose to apply. So Bethany, for example, she could have done special immigrant juvenile status, or she could have done the T. The
Mhm.
reason she chose the T was so that her mother and brother could join her.
That makes sense. So I just learned that Joari Hendricks, who was the presenter for Brussels Airlines, would like to ask you a question. Maybe he can be brought on camera to ask his question. And this will be the last question that we'll have in this session.
Okay, I will not take too much of your time, but thank you indeed for this wonderful presentation. What strikes me and what I think was very important also in your message in the fight against human trafficking was actually the fact how we're dealing with it on different levels. So you've been explaining that getting acquainted with someone, getting someone's confidence is so important in getting to know their story. And that is exactly what we need to do on a slightly other level at the airport itself. And that's what I meant with started to talk with simple conversations and things like that. So it is so important to take the best practices which you have in really the bigger picture, let's say it like that, to bring that down to the people here around the table who are mostly involved in aviation and the airport and so on, that we can take these lessons to us and that we can try and put it in another smaller perspective, but as useful as the work which you are doing. Also teaching people the types of visas for the US, for example, they're so extended that each visa has, I always say, has a story behind it.
Yes.
There's a reason why you have a certain visa, and that helps also people in looking at how should we approach a person? What is the story behind it? And is the story relating to the kind of visa that these people are carrying with them? And that's also an important message, I think, that you've been bringing. So sorry, this is not a real question, but more a confirmation of what you were saying. But I find it really important to point that out in what you've been teaching us.
Yeah, so I would just say to the airline industry and the transportation industry, the more you can educate yourselves, and it's constantly changing about the requirements of the visa category, the more you could just maybe have a friendly conversation. So if you're looking at those passports and visa stamps and you see it's a B2, that's a tourist visa, and you say, so what are you going to do? Just in a cheerful way, not in a border officer way. And they say, oh, I can't wait to go to Disneyland, right? As you were saying in your example, I've heard Disneyland so many times. I think that Walt Disney Company should fund all our work, you know, since they've become such a lure. And you just know that that's not adding up. You can try to figure that out. And another example is you may ask the child may have a student visa in their passport. And you say, well, where are you going to go to school? And they say, I'm not going to go to school, I'm going to work. And so it's these inconsistencies with the way someone's dressed or what they say they're doing. Also, if they're afraid to answer your question. Yeah, it's really hard. I just don't know how you do it in such a short time frame. I just want to make one more point on this. In my experience, it takes months before a young person will reveal the entire context of what has happened. They can't tell you in a 20-minute interview at the airport or at a Customs and Border Protection arrest. That's why our systems need to have built-in legal representation, social work support, psychological support to allow the young person or the victim, adult, to have a platform of safety and trust before they really give us the whole story.
Well, that's so true, Lenny. And that's really an African concept, the essence of this whole idea that it takes a village to solve this problem, and that we are all talking about different ways how we can participate in that village. So on that note, I want to thank you for a really full session, so chock full of information, so helpful. You've been a lovely presenter. And I want to turn it back over to Honorable Cynthia Blandford to open up our closing session today.
Thank you very much, Layli, for the opportunity to bring some closing remarks. But before I do that, there's a very special person. I hope Ambassador Patton has joined us. I see that he is signed in. Ambassador? Ambassador George S.W. Patton Sr. is a career diplomat with more than 2 decades of experience in the Liberian Foreign Service. He served in various capacities at the Liberian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and rose to the ranks of the Liberian Foreign Service. Prior to his appointment as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Liberia to the United States of America, Ambassador Patton served as a Liberian ambassador to Ethiopia, Kenya, and permanent representative to the African Union and to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. He previously served as Minister Counselor in charge of political and legal affairs at the Permanent Mission of Liberia to the United Nations. His functions included coverage of the United Nations Security Council, the African Union Observer Mission to the United Nations, expert in the 4th and 6th committees of the UNGA, peace-building expert and focal point for the Liberia country-specific configuration on the agenda of the Peace-Building Commission, PBC, to name a few. Ambassador Patton has other diplomatic assignments, or he had other diplomatic assignments in West, North, and East Africa as counselor and first secretary, respectively. Ambassador Patton has a master's degree in international relations from the University of Liberia, where I also attended, a bachelor's degree in laws from the St. Mary's University College in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Liberia. His Excellency has certificates in diplomacy, public international law, and conflict management and resolution. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome by phone His Excellency Ambassador George S.W. Patton Sr. to bring remarks. Ambassador, I'm bringing you up to the computer now. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. It's unfortunate my face cannot come on this thing, but I am glad to be here. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I would like to begin my own presentation by extending profound thanks and appreciation to Honorable Senator Blanford for organizing this very important workshop on human trafficking and for bringing together a distinguished group of speakers who are well experienced and versed on the issues of human trafficking. Human trafficking continues to be a challenge, not only in Liberia, but in many countries across the world. In its 2018 report, the UN highlighted that 50,000 individuals were found to have been trafficked across 148 countries. While we are aware that human trafficking can happen in every community, and victims can be of any nationality, race, and gender, other factors such as poverty, displacement, cultural practices, and unemployment increase a person's likelihood of victimization. Trafficked persons are often subjected to extreme psychological and physical abuse at the hands of traffickers, resulting in potential life-threatening health issues, physical injuries, mental trauma, ostracism, social rejection, etc. In recent years, Liberia has been identified as a country of origin, transit, and destination for internal human trafficking. Human trafficking exists in the country partly due to cultural or traditional practices, but other factors such as the civil war, youth unemployment, orphanage accreditation, and adoption issues, illicit mining, etc., have all contributed to the current human trafficking debacle in Liberia. There are reports that the internal trafficking is the more prevalent in Liberia than international trafficking. The reports indicate that women, girls, and children are often trafficked from rural towns and villages to urban areas for domestic services, sexual exploitation, street vending, and other forms of exploitation. As part of efforts to prevent human trafficking, Liberia enacted a critical piece of legislation in 2005 called the Act to Ban Trafficking in Persons within the Republic of Liberia. The law prohibits all forms of internal and international human trafficking, including labor and sex trafficking, and prescribes relevant penalties. The law demands transportation companies to verify that every traveler possesses the necessary travel documents, including passports and visas, to enter a designated country and any transit country. It outlines the responsibilities of commercial transportation companies in the fight against human trafficking and proposes consequences for failure to comply with the specified requirements. Ladies and gentlemen, also in 2005, the Women and Children Protection Section was established at the Liberian National Police to provide protection for women and children and to investigate cases of human trafficking. A national anti-human trafficking task force was established and is headed by the Ministry of Labor. It cuts across the government agencies and institutions and comprises the media and civil society. In 2019, the Liberian government launched its second 5-year national action plan to combat trafficking in persons in Liberia. The plan was one of several actions taken by the government to deal with the risks and perils imposed by transnational criminal networks using Liberia as both a transit and destination points. While the law remained in force, a critical component of the prosecution of traffickers has, over the years, been a challenge and a rallying concern among many stakeholders in Liberia's drive to curb the menace. And so, after broad consultations, the government of Liberia this year amended the anti-human trafficking law to give it more teeth to bite. The focus of the amendment was its ability to prosecute offenders and provide protection for witnesses. It also has a stringent imprisonment requirement if offenders are found guilty. Lack of prosecution of offenders engaged in trafficking has been a major concern by the U.S. government and other stakeholders. Support of the U.S. Embassy, the International Development Law Organization, and other stakeholders was crucial in achieving this milestone of amending the law and giving it more obligations and more possibilities to prosecute individuals allegedly engaged in trafficking in persons. The law has been printed and published. The government of Liberia is providing funding and is engaging civil society groups and the national media to undertake wider public awareness of the new law. The government has initiated investigation into allegations of trafficking, identified new shelter for victims, and is collaborating with foreign governments in tracking offenders. There are about 6 trafficking cases personally before the courts in Liberia. As an indication of the government's seriousness to prosecute, a group of lawyers has been hired by the government to prosecute these cases. In conclusion, I wish to commend Honorable Consul Blanford again for keeping the focus on this important subject. I wish to thank all participants and panelists for the important perspectives they have brought to this discussion. The Liberian government understands the magnitude of human trafficking and will continue to work with partners and take proactive steps to save its citizens and foreign nationals residing in the country against trafficking. The continued support of partners is essential in providing training for security personnel working around the clock at both entry and exit points to be able to identify incidents of human trafficking. Training for members of the press may also be necessary in gathering information on this threat. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for those incredible remarks on behalf of the Liberian Embassy in Washington, D.C. We wish we could see you in person. We understand the technical difficulties, but again, we look forward to working with you. On behalf of our partnership team here, our grantor and our grantees, we expect that you will be certainly a part of our expanded team. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are getting ready to conclude our program. And again, I apologize that we weren't able to see the ambassador in person on this. As we conclude today, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, stakeholders, civil society present, ladies and gentlemen, please let me say a heartfelt thanks and appreciation to all of you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to be a part of this very important workshop on how to identify, report, and help mitigate human trafficking in Liberia. A special thanks and appreciation to our grant partners, Wellesley Center for Women, under the leadership of Dr. Layli Mimpayan, Executive Director. Thank you for your outstanding leadership and your support. The Liberian Airport Authority, SM Brussels, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the University of Liberia. We appreciate all the good work and of course, the University Consortium for Liberia as well. I'm hopeful that with the additional training and advocacy that has been brought forward in our discussions today, Liberia will become a leader in helping to combat human trafficking and lead the way forward in this space. We look forward to working with LAA, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Wellesley Center for Women, the University Consortium for Liberia, and SM Brussels to convene a workshop on human trafficking in Liberia in 2022. A special thanks again to the U.S. Embassy in Liberia for allowing this opportunity to convene these meetings and for your funding support. Finally, I might mention to you on behalf of a joint mission that we are planning between Atlanta, Georgia, and Houston, Texas. We will have a trade mission, an education mission to Liberia, April 19th to the 29th, 2022. All workshop participants will receive this invitation flyer, and we welcome you to join us, where I will co-host the event along with City Councilwoman Carolyn Shabazz, District D in Houston, Texas. We will be your co-hosts. Again, on behalf of the University Consortium for Liberia Board of Directors and the Liberian Consulate in Atlanta, Georgia, you are most welcome. I will turn it over to Layli. Thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this important endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Blanford. And I want to add my thanks to all of the high-level and expert participants, as well as all of the attendees from the different transportation, travel, and tourism sectors, as well as other people who joined for a variety of reasons, in part because we hope that you'll be future partners in this work. So I just want to thank everyone on behalf of the University Consortium for Liberia and again, the Wellesley Centers for Women for attending Trapped in Transit, a human trafficking awareness workshop for the transportation, travel, and tourism sector in Liberia. And especially again, I'd like to thank the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia for funding this workshop. I now want to offer what I think we could call a closing charge to everyone who attended or participated. Our biggest goal was for all attendees to learn what trafficking is, how to recognize it, how to spot the signs, as well as to learn strategies to know what to do when they spot it. We now know many signs of trafficking thanks to our many expert guests and high-level presenters, whether sex trafficking, labor trafficking, child trafficking, or other kinds of trafficking. We know that it happens inside and between countries. We know that sometimes people know when they're being trafficked and sometimes they don't. We know that trafficking is a violation of human rights and that we're empowered to do something about it. We've learned how to work together with members of our respective professions, and importantly, how to collaborate and partner with people from other professions and industries to power up our efforts. We know that it takes a village to address trafficking, and we want to be part of that village. We know that culture is part of the equation. We're committed to doing more from this point forward to address trafficking. If we see something, we will say something, and we know how to do so without further endangering those that we suspect are being trafficked. So the closing charge is this. First, learn to recognize the signs of trafficking wherever you work. Get site-specific and take charge of improving the recognition of trafficking at your workplace. Second, network, collaborate, and partner with others inside and outside your industry, your sector, your company, or your organization to power up your work and your impact. For starters, you are now connected with everyone who attended this workshop, and you can certainly continue that networking through this collaboration between the University Consortium for Liberia and the Wellesley Centers for Women. You can reach out to Honorable Blanford or to myself if you'd like to continue with this work. Third, remember the local global connection. Trafficking starts and ends in the local context, but it is a global phenomenon, and we will need to address global factors like poverty, unemployment, lack of education, and importantly, gender inequality to really eradicate trafficking. So we all have to do two things at once. We have to work in our local context, but we also have to work on global issues. As Honorable Blanford mentioned, our collaboration will be producing a second workshop in Liberia in the first half of 2022, and our focus will be on market women and all of the ways that they can learn to recognize and stop trafficking in that context. We'll be collaborating closely with the University of Liberia and its new gender studies program, and we hope that many of you here today will be able to join us in this work. Honorable Blanford and myself will be coming to Liberia in a few weeks. It'll be an opportunity to have additional conversations, to continue with the research on local conditions and context, and an opportunity to form partnerships to do this important work moving forward. We can all make a difference. Thank you so much for sharing these last 2 days with us.
Thank you very much. We are wishing you all a wonderful and blessed rest of the day. And thank you so much again for the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia for your support of this important work. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful day and a great weekend. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you. Thank you all. That concludes the program.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.